and welcome folks. Welcome to Lit Valentine. It's my pleasure to welcome you all once again to my channel. Today we are going to focus on an interesting topic in the English literature. Let's see about that. I had given the key points. Today I am going to illustrate all the key points which I had mentioned here. So far we had seen about Greek classicism, Roman classicism, and the other thing is some of the famous writers and their works in the Old English literature and Middle English literature. All these things we had seen in an elaborate manner in the previous videos. Today we are going to focus on an interesting topic which is none other Geoffrey Chaucer, who is the father of modern English literature. Today, our topic is fully going to deal with Geoffrey Chaucer, who is known as the father of modern English literature. And then we are going to focus on how was the socio-political history of England was there during the time of Geoffrey Chaucer. If you take Chaucer, Chaucer was the major late medieval period writer. He lived at the time when lots of turmoils and transformations were happening in England and as well as in Europe. There was a 100 Years' War between France and England during the time of Chaucer, and also we have Black Death. The bubonic plague ravaged the entire Europe and came to England in 1348. So these led to all these Black Death and the 100 Years' War. All these lead to the social problems and thousands of people died, and the major thing is the peasants' revolt broke out during the time of Chaucer. The peasants want a better life and they live under better conditions. They want wages, money. So this thought, this intention lead to the peasants' revolt. So the peasants' revolt played a dominant role during the time of Geoffrey Chaucer. King Richard II crushed the peasants' revolt. This was the time of the Chaucer, but it indeed gave some new importance to the ordinary people. So during the time of Chaucer, the socio-political history of England was very much dealt with many issues like the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, the bubonic plague, and which ravaged the entire Europe and came to England in 1348. Thousands of people died due to that. Then the peasants' revolt broke out because the peasants want a better life, they want to live under better conditions, they want wages, money. So all these created lot of turmoils during the period of Chaucer. King Richard II crushed the peasants' revolt, and this was the time of Chaucer, but it indeed gave some new importance to the ordinary people. During the time of Chaucer, both French and Latin were the important languages, but English was not a literary language at all. If you take the languages in England, both French and Latin played the dominant role, but English was not a literary language during the time of Chaucer. French was the language of aristocracy and Latin remains as the language of episcopacy. Episcopacy means clergy. Latin is the language of the clergy people, the priest. It was the language of the clergy people, and French remained as the language of aristocracy, and a lot of poetry was written in French and prose in Latin, nothing in English. So if you take the time of Chaucer, both French and Latin played the dominant role. English was not a literary language at all, but the French language was the language of aristocracy and the Latin was the language of episcopacy. Episcopacy means clergy. The Latin was the language used by the clergy people, but a lot of poetry was written in French and prose in Latin. If you take poetry, it was written in French, and if you take prose, it was written in Latin. But if you take English, there were no works written in English during the time of Chaucer. But Chaucer wrote in English. He lived at the time when vernacular literature started rising. So once again I will repeat it. If you take the time of Chaucer, both French and Latin were the most predominant languages. French remains as the language of aristocracy and Latin remains as the language of episcopacy, that is the language of clergy people. Lot of poetry was written in French language, and if you take the prose, it was written in Latin. But there was no works which were written in English. It was Chaucer who was the first person who started writing in English. He lived at the time when vernacular literature started rising. Some of his contemporaries started writing in English. So, who are the contemporaries of Chaucer who started writing in English are William Langland, who wrote The Vision of Piers the Plowman, and John Gower, who wrote Confessio Amantis. The next person was John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English. All these people were the contemporaries of Chaucer who wrote in English. But it was Chaucer who was the first person who started writing in English because he lived at the time where vernacular literature started rising, and some of his contemporaries who wrote in English are William Langland, who wrote The Vision of Piers the Plowman, John Gower wrote Confessio Amantis, John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. So this is actually the beginning of the Renaissance period. Then we are going to focus on the birth of Chaucer. Chaucer was born in 1340. He was the son of a vintner, the son of a wine merchant, and he died in 1400 of the unknown causes. We don't know what is the actual cause for his death, but he was died in 1400. He was just started as a small one, then he grew big. He studied law, he became a diplomat, he was a very important influential figure in the old eras, and he married Philippa Royet, who was the sister of John of Gaunt's wife. He married Philippa Royet, who was the sister of John of Gaunt's wife. John of Gaunt was a very famous and most powerful person during the time of Chaucer. He was a nobleman of England at the time, and he was Chaucer's patron. John of Gaunt was the patron of Chaucer, and Chaucer bought John of Gaunt in one of his works, that is the Book of the Duchess. All these works, that is the Raiment of the Rose, the Book of the Duchess, the House of Fame, Consolation of Philosophy, Troilus and Cressida, the Legend of Good Women, all these are important work of Chaucer. Here I want to mention that John of Gaunt was the patron of Chaucer, and Chaucer brought John of Gaunt in one of his major works, that is the Book of the Duchess. Chaucer wrote an important dialect during the time, that is East Midland dialect. So if you have a question like that, what is the important dialect Chaucer wrote during at his time was? The answer is East Midland dialect. His works can be divided into three phases. First French, okay, then Italian, then English. Initially he was influenced by the French language, that is the French phrase. So his works were divided into three phases, that is French, Italian and English. Initially he was influenced by the French language, then Italian, then English. That is why his works were divided under three categories, that is French phrase, Italian phase and English phase. Okay. Chaucer lived at the time of three kings and he was involved in political affairs. During his time, he had seen three kings and he was involved in political affairs. He traveled abroad and he was the head of the king's works. So all these experiences are seen in his work. If you take the work of Chaucer, we can witness about who are all the three kings who lived during his time and what are all the political affairs had taken place and his traveling, and he was the head of the king's works. So all these influences, all these things can be witnessed in his works. In the beginning of this period, he must have translated the dream allegory called the Roman della Rose, which is translated as Romance of the Roses. There were two major genres in Middle English literature. Actually, in the medieval European period, there were the dream allegory and the chivalric romance. So, in the medieval European period, there were dream allegory and as well as the chivalric romance. Roman de la Rose is a French dream allegory which Chaucer translated as the Raymond of the Rose. In modern English, it is called as Romance of the Rose. So here, the Raymond of the Rose is the important work of Chaucer, which is a dream allegory. That is, Roman de la Rose is a French dream allegory which Chaucer translated as the Raymond of the Rose. In modern English, it is called as Romance of the Rose. Okay, so it is actually the translated work of the French. Okay, Roman de la Rose is the original name, that is the French dream allegory, and Chaucer, he translated it as the Raymond of the Rose. In modern English, it is called as Romance of the Rose. And Chaucer's early dream allegory, that is the Roman de la Rose, was the original dream allegory, that is the Book of the Duchess. If you think that the Raymond of the Rose is actually the original dream allegory, it is actually not, my dear friends. The original dream allegory of Chaucer is the Book of the Duchess. If you take the Raymond of the Rose, it is also a dream allegory. It is a French dream allegory which Chaucer translated as the Raymond of the Rose. In modern English, it is called as Romance of the Rose. But the original dream allegory of Chaucer is the Book of the Duchess. Chaucer is seeing a black knight who is perhaps the John of Gaunt, and he is mourning for the death of his wife Blanche. So the Book of the Duchess is also called the Dream of Chaucer. Obviously, being an early work, it came in the French phase. As I said you before, his works were divided into three phases, that is French, Italian and English. If you take the Romance of the Rose, it were under the French phase. The story of the Roman de la Rose, that is the story of the Roman de la Rose, is Chaucer is seeing a black knight who is perhaps John of Gaunt, and he is mourning for the death of his wife Blanche. So the Book of the Duchess is also called the Dream of Chaucer. So the Book of the Duchess. The Book of the Duchess, you can witness John of Gaunt, his patron. He is mourning for the death of his wife Blanche. So all this story you can see in the work called the Book of the Duchess, which is actually considered as his original dream allegory. Obviously, being an early work, it came in the French phase. Then he is supposed to return a parody of Divine Comedy, that is called the House of Fame. Parody of Divine Comedy is the House of Fame. Okay, the House of Fame is the other important work of Chaucer. The parody of the House of Fame is Divine Comedy. Here you can see that Chaucer is traveling. He is going to a temple of glass. From there he is traveling to a desert. He is dropped by an eagle at the Tower of Ice. From there he goes to the House of Fame. Fame is a woman of wearing hides which many, who has many eyes and tongues. It means don't trust fame. It will say different things at different times. Fame is not the same for everyone at every time. So from there, Chaucer is traveling to the house made of sticks. It means it falls at any time. The house of rumor. So this was a very important text. So this is actually the story of House of Fame. It is the traveling, where and all the places Chaucer was traveling, all these things were defined here. There is also a different sort of thinking process. This is also a dream work of Chaucer, but the original dream allegory was the Book of the Duchess, where you can see his patron John of Gaunt, who is mourning for his dead wife Blanche. Okay, so that is remains as a dream allegory. So in the House of Fame, he is talking about, that is Chaucer is talking about what are all the negativities of fame. So at first he is traveling to a temple of glass. From there he goes to a desert. Then he is dropped by an eagle at the Tower of Ice. From there he goes to the House of Fame. Fame is actually a woman of wearing hides, many eyes and tongues. It means don't trust fame. It will say different things at different times. Fame is not the same for everyone at every time. So from there he goes to a house made of sticks. It means it falls at any time. The house of rumor. So this was a very important text, and this was the story of the house of fame. The House of Fame was also imitated by many other writers. During Chaucer's time, Chaucerian writers who imitated Chaucer. One of them was John Lydgate. So the House of Fame was a text imitated by John Lydgate. It is called as Temple of Glass. Actually, it was the work, the House of Fame was the work by Chaucer. From this work, the House of Fame, many other Chaucerians who influenced by Chaucer were imitated this work, that is the House of Fame. So John Lydgate was the first person who imitated the work of Chaucer, that is the House of Fame. He wrote a work called Temple of Glass. Then we have Alexander Pope, who wrote a poem modeled on House of Fame. It is called Temple of Fame. After House of Fame, Chaucer wrote Parliament of Fowls, which is also an important work. Here I had forget to mention about it. So let's explain that. So the House of Fame was imitated by many other writers. The first one was John Lydgate, who wrote Temple of Glass. Then Alexander Pope, who wrote a poem modeled on House of Fame. It is called Temple of Fame. After House of Fame, Chaucer wrote Parliament of Fowls, which was the first work to be written in 7 lines. That is Chaucerian stanza. It is called as Chaucerian stanza or rhyme royal. Chaucerian stanza which later became rhyme royal. That is James I of Scotland, the king. He was the first person who wrote King's Square or King's Men. So he was the first person who started writing in the Chaucerian stanza. So that is why it is called as rhyme royal. The Chaucerian stanza or rhyme royal. But it was Chaucer who had first made that genre to appear in his work Parliament of Fowls. So in Parliament of Fowls you can witness the genre, the Chaucerian stanza, which has 7 lines, and it was the first work to be implemented. It was called as rhyme royal because James I of Scotland, the king of Scotland, he was the first person who initiated it, who formed this genre. So that is why it is called as rhyme royal. James I wrote King's Square or King's Men. It was the work of James I of Scotland. And if you take Parliament of Owls is set on St. Valentine's Day, birds are choosing their partners, their male partners. The 3 male eagles want the same female eagle. So this was the story of Parliament of Owls. After the Parliament of Owls, Chaucer wrote the translation of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. Consolation of Philosophy was the work of Boethius. Here Chaucer translated the work. Then King Alfred also translated it. Boethius was imprisoned and was awaiting for the execution, and he wrote Consolation of Philosophy. So here if you take the Consolation of Philosophy, it was written by Boethius actually, who was imprisoned and was waiting for his execution. So during that time he wrote the work called Consolation of Philosophy. Later Chaucer translated it. Then King Alfred also translated the work, that is the Consolation of Philosophy. Consolation is actually an important genre in literature. Then Chaucer wrote Troilus and Cressida. It is about the fickle woman Cressida from Trojan War. She is cheating Troilus, which is a negative impression of a woman. Chaucer is giving a very negative picture of Cressida's love. She is very fickle and not loyal. So this was actually the story of Troilus and Cressida, which was written by Chaucer. Okay. Then he wrote a palinode. A palinode is actually a work where an author retracts his former ideas. So the palinode which represents the women in a good manner. So it is the legend of good women where Chaucer written women, that is he portrayed women as a good character. So in the previous work, that is in Troilus and Cressida, he portrays Cressida, the women character, as a fickle one. He portrayed women character, that is the Cressida character, as a negative impression. So the negative picture of a Cressida's love, the negativities of a woman, he portrayed all that in his work Troilus and Cressida. After that, he wrote a palinode. What is actually a palinode? A palinode is a work where an author retracts his former ideas. So here the palinode work is the Legend of Good Women. The Legend of Good Women is the palinode of Chaucer, where he retracted his former ideas which he presented in Troilus and Cressida. In Troilus and Cressida, he portrayed women as a negative one, whereas in the Legend of Good Women, he had talked about 10 stories of wonderful women who are cheated by wicked men. So here the alternate story. Here 10 stories of wonderful women are presented who are cheated by the wicked men. So this Legend of Good Women is a very famous work because Chaucer introduced a heroic couplet or a decasyllabic couplet here. Couplet means 2 lines. So decasyllabic means 10 lines. 10 syllables divided into iambs, unstressed and stressed syllable. So Chaucer introduced it, and then came Chaucer's important work, the Canterbury Tales. So we can see about the Canterbury Tales in a more detailed manner in my upcoming video, friends. So till that, bye, have a nice day, enjoy your day, thank you.